Right. Gonna talk about, did Jesus exist? In fact, the claim that I'm going to make is very, very humble. The only thing I'm going to claim is yes. That's the extent of what I'm going to try to demonstrate tonight, is that did Jesus exist? And what's odd is it's almost awkward that I have to argue for this now, but it is becoming more and more predominant to state that Jesus didn't exist. Not that we had that, you know, he did and they made stuff up about him, but I mean, they're just going on straight up and they're saying Jesus didn't exist at all. You know, we can't know, and there was no Jesus. It's a complete fabrication of an individual over centuries and centuries of overlay by the Christian church itself. And so I'm going to respond to what's called the Jesus myth. And in fact, here at UTD, there have been speakers like a guy named David Fitzgerald. Is that his name? I think it's his name. And he wrote a book called Nailed. It is a self-published book. I did check that out. And where he actually claims that Jesus didn't exist. I'm going to go through a quick history of the Jesus myth movement that had some predominance in the late 19th, early 20th century, but it was totally swept away very, very quickly by the 30s. You know, but then it started coming back, you know, and then it went away again. It just keeps coming, it keeps coming back. It's weird, you know, kind of thing. So anyways, Bertrand Russell, he's a famous atheist in England. I think he died in 1970 is when he passed away, but a very, very well-known philosopher, and a good philosopher, I think, as well. He said, historically, it's quite doubtful whether Christ ever existed at all, and if he did, we know nothing about him. This is from his book, Why I'm Not a Christian, which was very, very successful, though I've read it and I was not impressed with his argumentations in it, but that's the claim that he makes. This is Dawkins, real famous atheist, as we probably have heard. Nobody knows who the four evangelists were, but they were almost certainly never met Jesus personally. Much of what was wrote was in no sense an honest attempt at history, but was simply rehashed from the Old Testament, because the gospel makers were devoutly convinced that the life of Jesus must fulfill Old Testament prophecies. It's even possible to mount a serious though not widely supported historical case that Jesus never lived at all, has been done by, among others, Professor G.A. Wells of the University of London in a number of books, including Did Jesus Exist? As well. So I want to talk about the origins of what I call do you want to keep the lights out? Would it be better with the lights out to see it? Yeah, let's do that. All right, the origins of the Christ myth. Yeah.
One thing about the prof that Dawkins references there, he's a professor of German, not history.
Yeah, you're still in my thunder, Alan. I mean, seriously. I mean, you invite me to speak, you know. So anyways, origins of the Christ myth. Bruno Bauer probably was one of the earliest individuals that began to claim that Jesus never existed. He lived 1809 to 1882. And he's an early writer, theologian. He said Mark basically invented Jesus and convinced other people of the authenticity of his writing. He had very little impact on mainstream scholarship, but Arthur Drews, he wrote a book called The Christ Myth that was published in 1911. And he based his work on what's called the History of Religion School, which was a German school of thought that I'll talk about here in a moment, represented by a very, very well-known scholar, James George Fraser, who wrote a book called The Golden Bow. It's a multi-volume work. I mean, he's a good scholar. He was a good scholar at the time, you know, but most of his work has been discounted. John M. Robertson was was Britain's most important early mythicist. He was a self-taught journalist. He wrote a book called The Jesus Problem, which is the front cover of it, developing Jesus from pre-Christian myth. All right, so these early Christian myths, and they begin to add and add and add to it. William B. Smith, an American mathematician, wrote a book called The Birth of the Gospel. Christianity was a product of Jewish diaspora. Basically, the Jews after 70 AD were dispersed after Jerusalem was destroyed. Ultimately, by 73 AD, all of Israel was destroyed, you know, by the Roman Empire at the Jewish wars, and they dispersed the Jews. That's it's Latin for dispersion. And basically, Christianity resulted from this dispersion of the Jews as well. And then finally, one of the last attempts in the 1920s after they began to abandon this thesis, was a book in 1968 in which John Allegro wrote a book called The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. And you can imagine what this one is about. Basically, he's stating that Jesus' disciples were basically doing drugs, mushrooms, and they were hallucinating everything, and they hallucinated the Jesus, is what they actually were promoting. This pretty much destroyed his academic career. No one really took him seriously at all. But by the 20s, this history of religion school had abandoned its thesis, you know, but it's sort of like, and the history of religion school is a school that was based in Germany. All right, it was real popular late 19th, early 20th century, and it just sort of is getting revived, got revived in America in the English works. Probably the person that revived it more than anyone else was G.A. Wells, not to be confused with H.G. Wells. All right, but G.A. Wells, he sort of brought the Christ myth thesis back to life, and now he sort of resurrected it, get it? All right, now in 1971, I wrote this book called Jesus and the Early Christians, and so I want to focus a little bit about him. As Alan said, he's a professor of German. All right, he is not a historian. He is not a theologian. He's not a New Testament scholar. In fact, a lot of these guys we legged, they were mathematicians, journalists. They weren't historians at all. And of course, what J.A. Wells did is he would read the German works of Drew and Bauer and others, and he basically got these ideas because he taught German, so he knew German obviously very well, and he started publishing these ideas that had gone out of vogue 50 years earlier in Germany, and he's bringing them back into vogue in the English language. He wrote a book in '75 called Did Jesus Exist?, which obviously Richard Dawkins was referencing, the historical evidence for Jesus in '82, the Jesus legend in '86. And so there's been, what's interesting, and what Richard Dawkins does not say or does not know, I don't know which it is because I can't divine his thoughts and intentions there, but there's been an evolving Wells throughout the years. In '71, he said Jesus developed from pagan parallels. And I don't have time to get into too much of the details, but a lot of the Jesus mythicists would state that, well, all these dying and rising gods, they came from pagan religions of Dionysius and Horus, which that's another whole issue that I don't have time to really get into, these pagan parallels. But then in '75, he began to adapt the most radical points of the scholars. And so what he would do is he would go find a scholar, and every scholar, no matter what scholar you find, they're going to have like one little radical point, right? And everything else is just great. And what he does is he goes and finds a scholar and just takes that one point from that scholar, takes the most radical point from the next scholar, takes the most radical point, and just, you know, puts it together and says that's what Jesus is. And you're just like, well, seriously, I mean, if you're going to do that, I mean, you could, it's sort of like cherry picking your evidence is what you're doing. In '82, he dumped the parallels in favor of Jewish myth, that there were these Jewish myths, and then they began to develop, and then it developed into what the Jesus that we know. In '86, he actually said Jesus lived in 100 BC. Now, this is completely different from what he started out as. This is the evolving Wells, right? So he went from Jesus didn't exist to he does exist, or not did, but did exist in 100 BC. And then in the 90s, he's dropped the Christ myth altogether. There is no myth about Jesus. In fact, in the 2000s, he's accepted that Paul knew Jesus and Jesus was being crucified by the Romans, that's actually what we know about Jesus, isn't it, right? I mean, sort of like, it's okay, it's fine. It's good to see a German professor has come around to the truth. I don't know why people are reading German professors and not historians on the topic, but that's sort of what happened. And of course, that's what Richard Dawkins is saying, is this German professor is making the historical case, which this German professor, by the way, and I mean German, I don't mean he was German, he taught the German language as his profession, you know. And he's actually rejected that position now. Some contemporary mythicists are Oral Doherty. He's probably the most well-known mythicist today. In the 1999, he wrote the book, The Jesus Puzzle. He's a very notable mythicist. He is not a historian, by the way, either. Timothy Freke, or how do you pronounce that name? Peter Gandy, and also in '99 wrote The Jesus Mysteries. sort of emphasizing the pagan parallels that the dying and rising gods of Dionysius and Horus and Mithra, and the like, are where, the disciples and later Christians developed different ideas of the life of Jesus. And this actually is a picture of Dionysius hanging on a cross, but what they don't tell you in this book, which was known when they published the book, is this artifact is fake. It is not accurate. And they published it on the front of their book anyways. All right? And then Deconstructing Jesus. This guy does have some credentials. Robert M. Price is a PhD in theology and in New Testament studies. He wrote a book called Deconstructing Jesus in 2000. He's probably the most well-credentialed mythicist out there, but he can't get a job at an academic institution anywhere, oddly enough, with his radical positions that he's holding, because no one really takes his position very seriously. So let's go to the thesis of these contemporary mythicists. Jesus Christ never existed as a historical figure, but as a myth created by the early Christian community. So two major claims: no early sources documenting the life of Jesus, and early Christians borrowed from pagan mystery religions to invent the Christ figure. All right, so no early sources, and they borrowed from the pagan mystery religions to come up with the very life of Jesus and the figure of Jesus himself. And that's the two claims that I'm going to be looking at with the Jesus mythicist claims. I actually think we have really good evidence to think Jesus existed. And one evidence that we look at is what we call extant manuscripts. Extant means existing manuscripts of the New Testament. This is actually a picture of the Chester Beatty Papyri. It dates about 250 AD and contains most of the New Testament. Now, what's commonly misunderstood about the New Testament is most people think the New Testament is one book. The New Testament, or Bible as sometimes it's popularly called, is not a single book. It's more like an anthology. There are different writers who wrote at different times, in different places, to different audiences. And that's what you call an anthology, right? And so for them to take these documents that were written on different countries and different times and different locations to different people by different people, it takes time for someone, especially in the 2nd, 3rd centuries, for them to put it together, because you don't have publishing houses, right? So these documents had to be around for quite a bit of time for them to collect it in the Chester Beatty Papyri. Another extant manuscript is called the Bodmer Papyri. It contains most of the Gospel of John, which dates around 200 AD. Now again, if roughly the years of Jesus are like 4 BC to 30 or 33 AD itself, this is still like 200 years, 150 years after his life, itself. But the Bodmer Papyri, it contains most of John by 200, so it had to be around. This is not the original Gospel of John that John wrote. This is a copy. That's why they call it a manuscript, to manually scribe. That's why it's called manuscript. Okay, and so they copied this, which means John really predates 200 AD. All right, so now we're pushing the Gospel of John into the 2nd century just from this existing manuscript itself, and that scholars have determined that John was the last gospel written, all right, itself, and meaning Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written before that, and Paul's writings even before that. Here's a very interesting manuscript itself. It is about the size of a credit card. It is basically a scrap piece of paper is what it is. It's called the John Ryland Fragment. And they call it the John Ryland Fragment because it's in the John Ryland Library at the University of Manchester. It was actually brought over from Egypt like in the 20s. And then I think it was in the 30s or 40s. My dates might be off a little bit there. Someone just discovered it in the University of Manchester Library and went, oh my gosh, this is the Gospel of John. It actually contains John 18:31 to 33 on one side, and then 37 to 38 on the other side. This is actually the John 18:31 to 38 is the trial of Jesus under Pontius Pilate, is what actually this is a reference to. And it's just a little scrap of paper. It was found in Egypt. Now that's really significant. It was in Egypt, but John didn't write in Egypt. So it had to travel to get down there. And think about it. How long would it take for a document to get down there? You don't FedEx it, do you? You don't have like a UPS office. It's going to take time for someone to have the wherewithal and intent to getting a document, putting it on a camel on their back or something like that. And really, the documents are the last thing you're going to be packing, right? When you're traveling across countries and, in the first, second, third centuries during those time periods, I mean, the first thing you're packing is food and water, then weapons. And then if you got room, maybe you take a parchment or two. Now, when does this fragment, again, it's not John's writing, it's a manuscript, it's a copy. What is the date of the John Ryland fragment? They date anywhere between 117 to 138 AD. And as of yet, this is the oldest manuscript of the New Testament to date. So I'll just give it a rounded date of 125 AD. That's early 2nd century, meaning John was written before 125 AD, probably in the 1st century, because this is found in Egypt, isn't it? Right? And if John was, I mean, you're pushing it right on top of the the crossover between the 1st and 2nd century right there. I mean, that means Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written before that, and some of Paul's writings even before that, and that's in the 1st century, the same century that Jesus lived. Now, why is that significant? Writings about Jesus, the same century that Jesus lived. Well, when you compare it to other historical figures like, let's say, Alexander the Great, right? We know Alexander the Great existed, but the first real biography that we have of Alexander the Great is 300 years after his life. And no one questions Alexander the Great. The first biography we have of Muhammad is 140 years after his life. And for Tiberius, a Roman emperor, the first real biography we have of him is 70 years after his life. And so if we got a document that's written in the same century that Jesus lived, that's within 70 years or even less. So we also know that the Gospels were even written before that from what we call early church fathers. Now, our early church father is basically someone who is a disciple of the disciples. Like John had a disciple named Polycarp. That's an unfortunate name, I know. I thought about calling my son that. Hey, come here, Polly, kind of thing. But so Polycarp, he was a disciple of John, and Ignatius was a disciple, and we actually have letters from these church fathers. They wrote to different people, to maybe another Christian, pastor, or to another church, and they're writing in the early 2nd century, and they're familiar with the apostles' writings because they're actually quoting from them. And so if they're quoting from them, if we can know when they wrote and they're quoting from those documents, that means those documents had to exist before they wrote it, or they couldn't have quoted it. Does that make sense? All right, so here's a couple of church fathers. Papias, he actually lived from 70 to 163 AD. He quotes from all 4 Gospels. Justin Martyr, living 100 to 165, he quotes from all 4 Gospels and 11 other New Testament texts. Polycarp, disciple of John, he's writing in 110 AD. He quotes all 4 Gospels and most of Paul's writings. All right, so that means right there, because Polycarp is writing at 110 AD, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John have to be dating before 110 AD. All right? Ignatius, writing in 107 AD, quotes from 24 different books of the New Testament. And this one, this is neat, Clement of Rome, so you don't confuse it with like the other Clement, but Clement of Rome, 95 AD, he is literally writing in the 1st century, very last part of the 1st century. He quotes from 11 different books of the New Testament itself, and this means those 11 different books themselves had to be written in the 1st century, before 95 AD. So we have these extant manuscripts, like the John Ryland fragment. We have even early church father quotations from the Gospels and the New Testament that are about Jesus, pushing it into the 1st century, the same century that Jesus lived. And that's the century you want a document written about Jesus, right? Because it's within the years and the lives of the eyewitnesses, unlike what Richard Dawkins was saying, right? And surely the evangelists or the writers of the Gospels never met Jesus or knew him. Well, if they're living in the same century as Jesus, then they probably knew him or knew someone who knew him, right? And in fact, that's sort of what we have. Matthew and John, they were actually disciples of Jesus. And then Mark and Luke, they weren't disciples, they knew disciples of Jesus, sort of like a reporter, right? And we take reporters seriously when they actually interview someone who witnessed an event. And that's what we have with Mark and Luke itself. But I think we can now, all I've done with this is really push most, if not all, of the New Testament is in the late first century, like the 170s, 180s, 190s. Pardon me, the 70s, 80s, and 90s, pardon me. You know, itself, the late first century itself. But Jesus lived in the first third of the first century. But I think we can actually date the New Testament even farther into the New Testament itself. And this one takes some, what we call some literary investigation. Let's take the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, written by the same person, Luke, right? Now, one of the things when most people read the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles is they don't realize that there is a literary structure to the work, all right? Meaning he organized it in a very specific, organized fashion. In fact, the focus of his work is around the city of Jerusalem. And we know this because of Acts 1, verse 8. In Acts 1, verse 8, it says, "You will receive my Holy Spirit to be a disciple in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth." All right? Now, when he said that, you'll be a disciple in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth, that is the literary structure of the book. In fact, Jerusalem is obviously the center point of the writing, because when you look at the first part of Acts, all the action is in Jerusalem. Then the next couple of chapters, it moves into Judea, and then it moves to Samaria farther out, and then the ends of the earth, which is basically Rome, because that's the world that they knew. So Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. You go to the end of the book of Acts, Paul is in prison in the city of Rome, right? He's at the ends of the earth at this point, right? So it moves out like concentric circles out of the city of Jerusalem. Now, what most people don't realize is that's how Acts is set up, but also Luke. His gospel is also set up that way, but in the exact reverse. The action in the Gospel of Luke doesn't start in Jerusalem, it starts at the ends of the earth. He's starting with the census, right? He's talking about the Roman Empire, and then he quickly moves to Samaria. It's where Nazareth is, right? And then he moves into Judea with the ministry years of Jesus, and then the very last couple of weeks in the Passion Week of Jesus, all the action is in Jerusalem. Then Luke ends the Gospel, and he expected whoever was reading his Gospel to pick up the Acts of the Apostles, even though in our Protestant New Testament Bibles, Acts and Luke are separated by John, itself. He would say, after you read the Luke, my gospel, then you read the Acts because of that literary structure. So it's almost like a funnel. Imagine a funnel starting in the ends of the earth, Samaria, Judea, focusing on Jerusalem. And then Acts opens up and it starts in Jerusalem, moves to Judea, then Samaria, and then the utter ends of the earth. So Jerusalem is unbelievably focused in these two books. Now, what event is strikingly absent in Luke and Acts? Anybody know what event is not mentioned in Luke and Acts? I'm asking a historical question here. It's not mentioned. But it is a major, major event, especially for the Jews.
The destruction of Jerusalem.
Yeah, the destruction of Jerusalem. What date was that? Anybody know the date offhand?
70 AD.
Yeah, it's 70 AD is what it is. All right? So the destruction of Jerusalem is not mentioned anywhere in the Gospel of Luke or anywhere in the Acts of the Apostles, which occurred in 70 AD, which is like, I wonder why he didn't mention that. Well, why do you think? Probably because it hadn't happened yet, exactly. It's like, go figure, if Jerusalem is so, prominent in the very literary structure of these two books, I dare say it probably hadn't occurred, and that's why he hadn't mentioned it. And some might say, well, that sounds like an argument from silence. Well, yes, it is, and argument from silences are good at times. I have a book in my library. It's called On the History of New York City. And when I open it up and I've read through the book, I've read the whole book and it doesn't mention anything about 9/11. When was that book written? What? Well, I don't know. I mean, before what, obviously? Before 9/11, 2001. You know, without even looking at, you know, like the copyright page, I know it was written before 2001 because the Twin Towers coming down in 9/11, 2001, that was formidable, you know, for that city. And the fact that that book on the history of New York City does not mention, you know, the Twin Towers being struck on 9/11 on that fateful day means obviously that book was written before that event actually occurred. And I'm just going to be quite honest, as bad as 9/11 was for America in New York City, it was a drop in the bucket compared to Jerusalem. Because at the end of the day in 70 AD, when Rome destroyed Jerusalem, they tore down the wall. They kicked out all of the citizens of the city. They even destroyed the temple, the very focal point of the Jewish religion for thousands of years. It's still destroyed to this day, you know, and they still face it, you know, at the Wailing Wall, a very, very focused, you know, event, you know, and it's not mentioned anywhere. And then they kicked out all the Jews out of Israel, and you can't even live here. Israel ceased to be a nation after the Jewish wars with Rome. Now, at the end of the day, 9/11, we still had America, didn't we? If 9/11 was like the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, it wouldn't just be planes in the Twin Towers. It'd be plane into the Pentagon. It would also be a plane into the White House, into the U.S. Capitol, and you know, into the Library of Congress. And then they'd round up all our political leaders, kick them out of the country, and U.S. would cease to be a country. That's the equivalent. I dare say Luke would have mentioned something. Just something. This is good evidence that was written before 70 AD. Now think about that. If Luke was written before 70 AD, and Acts was written, well, actually, Acts was written before 70 AD, and Luke was written before Acts, we can start pushing the New Testament and these writings very close to the life of Jesus. All right? So why did the New Testament get dated in the first century? Well, think about it. Fall of Jerusalem and the fall of and the destruction of the temple in 70 AD had occurred, and it's like a timeline. I'm going backwards in the timeline. Usually we go left to right, right? But I'm trying to what do you call, like in engineering, they call like reverse engineering. I guess I'm reverse engineering history, you know, is what I'm doing. But this is how historians do it, right? So 70 AD, Acts was written before 70 AD. Luke was written before Acts. Matthew was written before Luke. I'm just running out of room on the screen at this point, right? Mark was written before Matthew, and Paul's writings were written before Mark. Now look, if I just do a very conservative 5-year leap between these books, if Acts is 5 years before, that's 65 AD. This is 60 AD. This is 55 AD. This is 50 AD. And some scholars date Paul's writings in the 40s. That's just like a decade after Jesus, right? A couple of decades, that's not too bad when you're talking about biographies of Alexander the Great 300 years after his life, or biography of Tiberius Caesar, a Roman emperor, 70 years after his life, or for Muhammad, the second biggest religion on the planet, it's 140 years after his life. We're doing pretty good for documents about the life of Jesus. Now let's talk about this life of Christ borrowed from pagan religions. All right, this is real popular. Many mythicists claim that Christianity borrowed beliefs about Jesus from these pagan religions. And these are just some of the people that do this. There's this documentary called The God That Wasn't There by Brian Fleming. He actually went and attended like a private high school, Christian private high school, and then abandoned his faith. And he sort of made a splash in the early 2000s on YouTube with this I Deny the Holy Spirit movement, where he challenged people to say, I deny the Holy Spirit, and put it on YouTube. Here's Deconstructing Jesus by Robert Price, you know, Frake and Gandy's The Jesus Mysteries. Tom Harper, he wrote the book called The Pagan Christ. Former Anglican priest. And then what was really, really big in 2007 is this movie right here. It's an internet movie or documentary called Zeitgeist. Anybody seen Zeitgeist? Raise your hand if you've seen Zeitgeist. One person has seen Zeitgeist. Oh, interesting. In 2007 when it came out, and I'll just be honest, I didn't see it. A student came up to me after one day at the school that I teach, says, I just don't think Jesus existed. I don't even think he rose from the dead. I go, why? Why not? And he looked at me and he said, because they just borrowed all the different points of Jesus' life from these pagan mystery religions like Dionysius and Horus and Mithra. And I looked at him, I go, I didn't know what to say to him. So last week I talked about the Columbo tactic, so I employed it. And I said, where'd you get your information? And he goes, YouTube. And I was like, yeah. Just because it's on YouTube doesn't make it true. It doesn't make it false, but consider the source. Maybe you want to dig a little bit deeper. Where's that YouTube video getting its information? Which, by the way, this YouTube video gets its information from all these books right here. That's where they got them all from. All right, so let me talk a little bit about the background of the life of Christ being borrowed from pagan mystery religions. And I mentioned a little bit, it's from this group of scholars in Germany called the Religionsgeschichte School. I have no idea if I've pronounced that correctly. All right, it's German. If you just say it real gutturally, it sounds accurate. It's amazing, right? And it's just, you translate it, it just means the history of religious school. You see the word religion, history there in school, right? The history of religion school flourished at the end of the 19th and the early 20th century. Included scholars like Richenstein, Sir James Fraser wrote The Golden Bow, Albert Schweitzer. And this history of religion school claimed that primitive Christianity had been influenced by Platonism, Stoicism, the pagan mystery religions, and other Greco-Roman movements that were out there. Sorry, I'd sort of cut off right there. But by the mid-20th century, the school thought had been abandoned by the academic community. All right? And so the question you need to ask is, why did they abandon this idea that Christianity borrowed from these pagan mystery religions by the mid-20th century? And one word describe it. It's called timing. Timing is just all off. For example, Mithra was a Persian god who was attested as early as the 14th century BC. Now that sounds like it predates Jesus, right? But here's the problem. You can't just show that it predates Jesus. You have to show a causal connection. And see, if I wrote a paper that just said, oh, obviously, you know, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, they looked at John Locke as support because John Locke predates him. I would be failed if I wrote that paper. I would have to show that Thomas Jefferson had access to John Locke and read John Locke and even admitted it and said, yeah, you need to read John Locke. Here's the deal. The problem is there's no evidence of Mithraism, this Persian religion, and in the sense of a mystery religion in the West. Now, when I mean the West, I mean the Greco-Roman world, which includes Israel, because Israel was under Roman governance, right? And the vast majority of the texts about Mithra date about 140 AD. Well, what's wrong with that date? That's after Christianity, not before Christianity. So the timing's all wrong. So you can't just say, yeah, Mithra's been around since 1400 BC. You have to show that Mithra's been around and it's actually infiltrated into the West and into the Jewish community, the Greco-Roman community. And we have no evidence of this whatsoever. In fact, Manfred Claus, a professor of ancient history at the Free University of Berlin, claimed in his book, The Roman Cult of Mithra, right? So he's obviously going to be an expert on this religion, says it doesn't make any sense to interpret the Mithric mysteries as a forerunner of Christianity. It just doesn't make sense to do this. Now look, you can either believe an internet video called Zeitgeist or Manfred Claus, a Free University of Berlin. Now I'm going with the scholar. I don't know about you, but I'm going with the scholar is what I'm going to go with. L. Patterson, in his book Mithraism in Christianity, published by Cambridge University Press, concludes that there is no direct connection between the two religions, either in origin or development. And he's actually talking about the both in this book. And he says there's no connection between the two religions in origin and development itself. All right? So let's take a look more about the timing. Chronology is just being all wrong. While some of the mystery religions predated Christianity, there's near universal agreement that there's no stories of dying and rising gods until after Christianity. And so the supposed parallels between Christianity and the pagan religions arose only after the origin of the church. The pagan religions could not have influenced Christian belief. That's why the history of religion school, the School of History of Religions, abandoned this idea because they knew the timing was off. The timing didn't match up. If you're going to have this kind of influence, the timing's got to match up, and it just doesn't. All right? There's this book called The Riddle of the Resurrection, written by T.N.D. Mettinger. He's a senior Swedish scholar, professor of the Lund University, and a member of the Royal Academy of Letters of History and Antiquities of Stockholm. He wrote one of the most recent academic books on this idea of dying and rising gods in antiquity. And that's why I called it the riddle of the resurrection. He concludes in his book on page 221, he says, there is, as far as I am aware, no prima facie evidence that the death and resurrection of Jesus is a mythological construct, drawing on the myths of rites of dying and rising gods of the surrounding world. And this is the most recent treatment of dying and rising gods. He says, we need to abandon this idea is what we need to do. There's a cover of his book right there. He actually reports that from the 30s, a consensus has developed to the effect that the dying and rising gods died but did not return or rise to live again. Those who still think differently are looked upon as residual members of almost an extinct species itself. I mean, it's basically anybody that thinks this is so academically out of vogue and not taken seriously in the academic world that basically, well, it takes German professors of the German language to resurrect them. You know, is what you have to do. Or an internet film called Zeitgeist, you know, itself is what you have to do, you know, to bring these ideas out. But the academics, they're not entertaining them. You have to self-publish your books like David Fitzgerald does in his book Nailed, who came here, I think it was last year that he came here, right? You got to self-publish your books is what you got to do, you know. And then when you do publish them, you can't get a job at an academic institution, all right? So now look at this quote right here, all right? Moreover, I know it's a little lengthy quote, but I think it's good. Moreover, aspects of the Jesus story simply would not have been invented by anyone wanting to make up a new Savior. The earliest followers of Jesus declared that he was a crucified Messiah. But prior to Christianity, there were no Jews at all of any kind whatsoever who thought there'd be a future crucified Messiah. The Messiah was to be a figure of the grandeur and power who overthrew the enemy. Anyone who wanted to make up a Messiah would make him like that. Why did the Christians not do so? Because they believed specifically that Jesus was the Messiah, and they knew full well that he was crucified. The Christians did not invent Jesus. That sounds like a good William Lane Craig quote, doesn't it? You know, or maybe you know, N.T. Wright, you know, kind of thing, and a good New Testament scholar. This is who quoted this. Bart Ehrman. Y'all knew who Bart Ehrman is? Bart Ehrman is not a Christian. He's not even a theist. And he's saying they did not invent Jesus. They would not have invented him like that. He's the professor, and where's he? He's University of North Carolina professor of New Testament studies itself. No friend to Christianity. In fact, this is a picture of Bart Ehrman. He was on a radio show called The Infidel Guy Show. What a great name. I just laughed. I got to commend him for that name. That's actually a really good name. I like that name. All right? But he's on as a guest, and he's talking. And he actually is real famous for a book called Misquoting Jesus. You know, that really put him on sort of the more, you know, popular media stage. He's been around as academic since like the 80s itself, but there's this, it's really not a video clip, it's an audio clip because it was a podcast. That's what the Infidel Guy Show is. And I actually have a clip of it. Now these guys are on the same team, you understand? To put it bluntly, they're both infidels, right? That's why he's on the Infidel Guy Show. And they start talking about the historical Jesus. All right, and like the first guy that starts talking is going to be the Infidel Guy Show, and then the one that sort of comes in, sort of like he's on a telephone, it's not quite as clear as the first guy. That's Bart Ehrman. And I want you to listen to this clip. It's a rather lengthy clip, you know, to listen to, but I think it's worth listening.
Oh, here we go. Javi's asking, do you believe in the historical Jesus? That's a good question.
Yeah, you know, I was thinking about writing a book about this because I get the question a lot, and I unfortunately get quoted as someone who thinks that Jesus didn't exist, which I think is really very strange because I've written an entire book on what Jesus said and did.
Okay.
and for him to say and do anything, he had to exist. So I don't think there's any serious historian who doubts the existence of Jesus. There are a lot of people who want to write sensational books and make a lot of money who say Jesus didn't exist, but I don't know any serious scholar who doubts the existence of Jesus. And so absolutely.
Or shall we say a Jesus?
Well, I mean... Because
there's some ideas about this too, right? Like Jesus Christ itself, right? Just means, what does it mean? Like the anointed one or something?
Well, Christ is the Greek word for anointed one. It's the same, it's the Greek equivalent of the word Mashiach in Hebrew, which
Messiah,
is where we get Messiah from.
Right. So basically, so any Jewish sect that believed that they had that Jesus Christ, then that entity would exist, so to speak. So I mean, I guess what I'm saying here, I guess I'm going with maybe the multiple Jesus hypothesis, that there might have been a variety of different, which is why we have so many different stories.
I don't think there was more than one person. I mean, I think
really?
there was a historical person, Jesus, and that we can say some things historically about him. But what happened was, after his death, so many people told stories in so many different parts of the Roman Empire that different portraits of Jesus emerged. And some of these portraits show up in the Gospels, so that, in fact, the portrait of Jesus in Luke's Gospel is different from the portrait of Mark, and different from the one in John, and different from the one in the Gospel of Peter, or the Gospel of Judas. I mean, these are all different portraits.
Well, it sounds like, to me, there are people in the chat room right now disagreeing, of course, but they're saying that there really isn't any hardcore evidence, though, that, I mean, there isn't any evidence, really, that Jesus did exist, except what people are saying about him. But
I disagree with that.
Really?
What hardcore evidence is there that Julius Caesar existed?
Well, this is the same kind of argument apologists use, by the way, for the existence of Jesus, by the way.
What's that?
They like to say the same thing you just said just then about, well, what kind of evidence we have for Jesus?
Well, I mean, it's just a typical, I mean, it's a historical point. Right. I mean, how do you establish the historical existence?
Right. Well, I guess
from the past?
I guess it depends on the claims. It depends on the claims that people have made during that particular time about a particular person and their influence on society.
I mean, there are. One has to look at historical evidence. And if you say that historical evidence doesn't count, then I think you get into huge trouble, because then then why not just deny the Holocaust? Or, why not deny that Abraham Lincoln lived? Or why not deny, I think these things, I think it matters what happened in history.
Right. Well, what I like to say is, the way I like to word it this way, because, I mean, really, I think we do have more evidence for those things you mentioned than we probably do Jesus Christ. But I like to tell people, well, what harm would it do? Because especially the information that you have just now about even if there was a Jesus, the book of Mark shows us that there was an embellishment way after anyway.
Well, I mean, but there are people who want to know what Jesus really did say.
Right.
And that assumes that he really existed.
And that we can't know.
You have to look at the evidence.
What is the evidence? Because even that we cannot know for sure. But I guess you would say we can look at the earliest manuscripts that date to around when he should have existed or something, or what? What do we have? Because we don't have anything that exists until after he died, allegedly, right?
About him, you mean?
Right, about Jesus.
Well, that's true of everyone.
Well, not really. Aren't there some? I thought there were some. Well, I guess so. But I thought that there are some contemporary. That there are some writers who'd write about people as they existed, like with Julius Caesar, weren't there?
But Julie, we don't have anybody from that time talking to us now. All we have are ancient records.
Right, but again,
all we have for Jesus are ancient records.
But we don't have any ancient records of anyone who wrote about Jesus while he was alive, do we?
No, absolutely not.
And that's the difference.
Just as we don't have for billions of people who lived in the past that we're pretty sure existed. We have more evidence for Jesus than we have for almost anybody from his time period. So, I'm not saying this as a believer. I'm not a believer, but as a historian, I'm just saying that you can't just kind of dismiss it and say, well, we don't know. You have to look at the evidence. So there is hard evidence, I think.
Okay. I would look for archaeological evidence as well.
Well, for example, we have one author who actually knew Jesus' relatives and knew his disciples.
And who's that?
Paul.
How do we know that?
Because we have Paul's letters.
How do we know he didn't lie about it?
Why would he lie about it?
Well,
the point.
But there are people. There are people. But
Paul says things about Jesus as off-the-cuff comments, where he's not making a point. And see, that's very important to historians. In other words, a historian wants to find disinterested comments.
Right.
And Paul has disinterested comments where he says things, for example, about James, the brother of the Lord, which is just an off-the-cuff comment because everybody that he's writing to knows who he's talking about. So he just makes the off-the-cuff comment. That's very important information.
And that is if he wrote them.
Disciples. Now,
if he even wrote that
comment about the 12 disciples, if in fact, so the whole point is that you've got a disinterested comment from somebody who actually knew these people.
If he even wrote that, though, correct? Because isn't there some?
No, there's no doubt about Paul writing Galatians.
Aren't there some theories that suggest that maybe Paul himself had scribes that wrote for him?
Well, every person who wrote epistles in the ancient world dictated them to scribes.
Right. So how do we know then that?
Well, how do you know Cicero wrote his letters?
I don't. I'm not a historian, so I don't know much about
Right.
Cicero. But
well, I am a historian, and I'm telling you.
But there are some. but there are many historians who disagree with you, aren't they?
No, none that I've ever heard of.
Oh, really?
Well, not serious historians.
Not serious historians.
Listen, I know thousands of scholars of the ancient world, and I don't know any one of these scholars who doubts that Paul wrote Galatians.
Okay.
So these are people who have devoted their lives to this, and a lot of them are like me. It's not that I've got a personal investment in Paul. I mean, I'm not even a Christian.
Right.
I'm just saying, as a historian, there's no doubt Paul wrote Galatians.
I mean, I'm right with you. He probably wrote some things. I'm just saying, I just don't know if I'm just trying to figure out, because if we are, as you conceded already, that we know that there has been embellishment, people adding things as.
Right, but see, you can't just take that and just assume that everything is an embellishment. You have to do the serious historical work and figure out what's an embellishment and what's not. And that isn't just a matter of just guessing or...
I wasn't saying everything. I was just saying just be skeptical to that, too. That's all. I was just saying...
Well, absolutely you have to be skeptical about everything.
Right,
but once you approach it skeptically and you look at the... I've spent 30 years looking at... This is what I do for a living. So it isn't just kind of an off-the-cuff kind of comment. This is, I've been examining this evidence for 30 years, reading this stuff in the original languages. So it's not like some crazy person who just wants to make money out of a book. I mean, this is what I do for a living, and I can just tell you that everybody who's looked at this thing seriously, there's nobody who doubts this.
Well, I wouldn't say nobody. That's absolute.
Somebody.
That's an absolute claim, though, isn't it? I mean,
name one New Testament scholar who doubts that Paul wrote Galatians.
Oh, no. I remember you keep going back to that. I didn't deny that he wrote Galatians. I think I agree at least twice so far. I agree with you. He probably could have, for all I know.
Probably could have.
But I was saying,
did.
well, fine. But I'm simply saying, but actual content. How do we know that there aren't just complete lies or embellishments? And then you went back to, well, because he just said something off the cuff. Or
I'm agreeing that there are, but you have to know which things are the embellishments. It's not an embellishment that Paul met with James in Jerusalem. I mean, I don't, you can systematically doubt anything, sure, but I mean that's not how you do history. You do history by looking at evidence. Right.
What do you think about Dr. Bob Price? Dr. Bob Price is.
I don't know him.
You don't know Dr. Robert M. Price?
He's the guy who denies Jesus existed.
I think he's pretty much leaning more toward that. Yes.
Yeah. No, I mean, I don't think he. He's not. I don't really know him. No.
Interesting.
Why would I?
Oh, well, I mean, he's a theologian as well, and.
What books has he published?
You can look him up. He has too many to mention right now. Deconstructing Jesus. Have you heard that one? And.
Yeah, he's actually communicated with me, and he's told me some of his doubts, and I've been puzzled by it because I don't really understand. I haven't seen any evidence that he's adduced.
Okay. Well, there you go. Well, I would suggest maybe you want to read some of this stuff. But again, I know you're so busy. You probably read. It's just like me. I have 100 books on the shelf. I think I still haven't gotten a chance to read yet because I get books every week. But okay. But yeah. I mean, he's quite. People are posting them all in a room. The Colossal Apostle, the Shrinking Son of Man. But as you know.
Oh, that guy. Yeah, Shrinking Son of Man. Yeah. All right. Yeah.
Okay. That guy. Yeah.
Yeah. Sure.
So I mean, there are some people who've been researching even longer than you have, and they also have doctors, double doctors. They've been researching this. Some, I think he's even a professor at a university.
No, he's not.
He was teaching at where was he?
He doesn't have a teaching job.
I can't remember where he was. Well, actually, he did or does. I can't remember now.
No, he doesn't.
I don't keep up with him right now.
But. Well, with enemies like that, who needs friends? I mean, seriously, And it just goes on and on. I remember the very beginning of the interview, he says, I've been thinking about writing a book about this. And guess what he did? He wrote a book about it. Did Jesus exist? The historical argument for Jesus of Nazareth, where he states the affirmative, Jesus existed. Not a Christian, not even a theist himself. He's just tired of this claim that says Jesus didn't exist. He doesn't think Jesus is God, doesn't think Jesus rose from the dead. He's very, very skeptical of all those things, but he's definitely a believer in the historical Jesus, that he actually existed himself. It's an interesting book. I enjoyed reading it and going through it itself, you know. He actually says, this will be my last slide. He says, Jesus certainly existed, as virtually as every competent scholar of antiquity, Christian or non-Christian, agrees. So, quite honestly, Jesus did exist. And the best source of information that we have about him is the New Testament. And that's what Bart Ehrman writes upon, because he's trying to get back to the historical Jesus and who Jesus actually is. So this is my challenge for you. Why don't you read the New Testament for yourself? Read the Gospels. See what Jesus did and said. You know, and see what rings to you, and read it with an open mind as well. You know, I mean, yes, read it skeptically at times, but also read it with an open mind. Be open to the evidence of what Jesus is actually claiming in the text. Who is Jesus saying? Everybody wants to say something about Jesus, quite honestly. But at some point, you got to listen to what Jesus said. What did Jesus say about himself? With these early disciples, and people had access to disciples that were there, had access to people that were there who were recording the events and life and words of Jesus. With that, I want to just open it up for questions. Do you have any questions? Sorry about that. I should have warned you that it was coming. Yes, Clint?
I thought I saw some article. I'll need to go back and pull it up, but I'm just curious if you heard this, that I'll try and phrase it, but every maybe world religion has to describe who Jesus is to their perspective. Have you heard anything about that?
Yeah, everybody sort of wants a piece of Jesus. I don't know what article you might be talking about, but like, you know, Hindus try to say that he's a guru. You know, Islam says he's a prophet. You know, Judaism even says he's a rabbi, you know, which is sort of interesting that everybody wants to say something nice about Jesus, you know. Now, I think the real problem here is Jesus was very, very clear in the text. And it's in multiple texts, in multiple ways. Jesus isn't saying he's just a good teacher or a prophet or a way shower or a guru. He is very, very clear in what he says. I am God. He says it directly. He says it indirectly. He does it with his deeds and actions. He does it in every possible way. That is what he's trying to communicate. I'm just not a teacher. And he even says, why do you call me a rabbi? I'm not really, and he's really saying, I'm not a teacher. I am God. He does it by forgiving sins. Only God can forgive sins. And there's multiple ways. And so the deal is you can't just say, oh, he's a good teacher. Because if he's just a good teacher and teaching he's God, well, that's a pretty crappy teacher. If he's not God, but claiming that he is God, that's bad teaching, not good teaching. What if I ended my lesson today or my lesson at class, you know, after a year long of, you know, lessons and quizzes, and the students are just enamored with me, which they are. I'm an amazing teacher, by the way, you know, kind of thing. And they give me gift cards, which I gladly accept, by the way, you know, kind of thing. And they're just, you're awesome. And I said, you know what? I got one more lesson for you today. It's not that big of a deal. Don't even take notes. I'm not even going to quiz you, test you, or assess you on it. I'm God. Have a nice summer. Now, my anal retentive student that gets the A's, she's going to raise her hand and say, Mr. Lee, did you say you were God? Yeah, but it's not that big of a deal. Don't worry about it. What do you think they're going to think of me? That guy's a nut. Burn the notes. That was a waste of 9 months. You know, that's what they'd be thinking. And that's what you ought to be thinking about Jesus if you're not thinking he's God. Because that's what he taught about himself. And that's why I encourage you to read the text. What is Jesus actually saying about himself? How does he go about doing it? Even when he does miracles, the whole point of him doing miracles is to show that he's trying to be God. And that's the whole point, is what he's trying to do. So that's why I encourage you to go into the text itself, you know, and even go in with it skeptically. Go in skeptically and say, hey, is he really trying to claim to be God here? You know, see what's going on in the text. Anybody else got any questions or comments or, you know, that I can respond to? You know? Yes.
People like, I mean, maybe Bertrand Russell's a little bit older, but Dawkins or whoever else, contemporary, you know, people that would claim that Jesus didn't exist. What do they say about non-New Testament or non-biblical sources that, while they don't claim, belief in Christ, but they at least acknowledge his existence. Maybe pagan sources.
Yeah, there's non-biblical sources, or more precisely, non-Christian sources that reference Jesus as well. Like there's one by Tacitus, who we learn about the Roman emperors from. If you learn anything about Roman emperors, it's from Tacitus. That's where we get the most information about a lot of the Roman emperors themselves. He mentions Christ. I can't remember exactly what they say, I'd have to look it up. Pliny the Younger, who is obviously junior, he's a father, he's a governor in like Asia Minor. He actually talks about Christians who follow Christ. And, we have Suetonius, who's a Greek satirist writer who talks about Christ. We have like a dozen non-Christian sources that start talking about Christ. Some are as the late 1st century. Most of them are in the 2nd century themselves. But again, they don't give us too much information. But let's just pretend that we don't have the New Testament at all. Let's just say it just disappeared. I don't know how that would happen, but let's just say it did. If we only take non-Christian sources, I'm not even taking the church fathers' letters, which we would have those too. But let's say we don't even have the church fathers or the New Testament. What picture of Jesus would we have just from secular non-Christian sources like Tacitus, Pliny, Josephus, and the like? We would have a Jesus that was born, right, in Jerusalem, born in Bethlehem, that died in Jerusalem by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate, that did marvelous deeds or sorcery, which sounds like what? Miracles, right? They're trying to describe it somehow. And that he died by crucifixion, and the disciples believed that he rose from the dead 3 days after his death, and they worshiped him as if he was God. That's pretty much the New Testament in a nutshell. Right? You don't get the details, you don't get these really cool stories or anything, but that's pretty much the New Testament. They don't go counter to the New Testament. They're going with the New Testament is what they're doing. And if Jesus was a historical figure, which he was, and he did those things, that's what we'd expect from non-Christian sources. It's something congruent, not the details, but at least congruent and not contradictory with the New Testament accounts. One more. Anybody else? Clint?
Wasn't there something in the current events in the last few weeks? They found an old manuscript and a mummy mask.
Yeah, there is in the workings a manuscript of the Gospel of Mark. It has not been revealed what portion of Mark it is. It's just a little fragment. It's papyrus, right, is what it's called. And it was found on a mummy mask itself. And like 2 weeks ago, it started getting a lot of news attention. Though they actually discovered a long time ago, like in 2012. And it sort of came out, and then they sort of buried it. And, not buried it, but they sort of clamped up. And I'm not really sure, I'm not privy to this information, but apparently the scholars are under obligation not to say anything because of the owner of the mummy mask. Because mummy mask, apparently, I got pharaohs made out of gold, middle class, maybe upper royalty, but lower, or lower royalty. They might do gold leaf, but if you're middle class, you're made out of paper. Your mummy mask is made out of paper mache, and you wouldn't use papyrus that's brand new because that's expensive. You would use papyrus that's used, and you'd use those people you don't really care about their text, like Christians. And they would take manuscripts of the New Testament, and we've known this actually for quite some time, that these mummy masks made of paper mache have texts on them. And we just didn't know how to get to it. Someone invented a process to be able to dissolve the mummy mask dissolving the glue without harming the text. So that's the relatively new discovery. And apparently one of these mummy masks had a fragment from the Gospel of Mark, and they say it dates from the 80s. This would be the earliest fragment of the New Testament. I say this with qualification. It has to go through the academic hashing process. They got to publish it, you know, and apparently it's going to come out in published form in 2015. Hopefully, they said that in 2014. It didn't come out. Now we're pushing it to 2015. But they're going through the prerequisite steps of the academic, you know, process of the vetting process of academics. So they're not making a mistake. And it looks like this is going to be the case, that it will be a gospel, the fragment of the Gospel of Mark dating from the 80s. And it would predate the John Ryland fragment. It is an unbelievably monumental discovery if it pans out, which it looks like it will. But that's what they're talking about. It's also real controversial because you have to destroy Egyptian artifacts, you know, and so Egyptologists are not happy with this whole process at all. And so there's a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes. Like I started like searching like deep into academic blogs, and the Egyptologists they're infuriated about the whole process. That's a lot of what's going on there. So, all right, well, guys, I appreciate the time together.